So we're now into the second half. We're now talking about ethics for the green transition. Previously, we had a wonderful speaker who set us up for the whole session. We have an equally wonderful speaker to set us up for the whole session now. So, Ben Tabe, I'm delighted to welcome you to talk about the governance and ethics of emerging technologies for the green transition. He's Professor of Energy and Climate Ethics and Scientific Director of the Safety and Security Institute at Delft University of Technology. Over to you, Benham.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks to the organizers for having me here. Thank you for being here. I think I've been invited for different reasons, and I think one of those reasons, perhaps one of the most important reasons that I got invited to this session was actually the role I'm playing in science policy interfaces. I'm representing my university in The Hague, which is sort of the political capital of the Netherlands, but also somewhat also a very important UN city. The people in The Hague like to call themselves the second UN city of Europe after Geneva, hosting several actually UN-affiliated bodies. And my university, as a technical university, likes to be closer to public policy. But what does exactly mean? And is that some kind of techno-optimist, here we are offering you the solutions kind of approach, or is it a more critical, technologically informed approach? I think the latter, and I think the reason that they put me there to set up a campus for TU Delft as a philosopher, that says a lot about how even engineering schools started rethinking their approach to technology. And second is actually that, and that's on a personal note, I have the honor of being on a climate council in the Netherlands, which is a recently established council advising the government and both parliaments, the second and the first chamber in the Netherlands, on matters related to climate policy. This is actually, we have been around for a couple of months now, and the first advice is coming out in December. And it is interesting to also see sort of the science policy interfaces, and being an ethicist, we are 10 people from 10 different academic backgrounds. And that's quite a challenge. I hope that the results would actually be worth it, but it's quite a challenge to arrive at 10 different perspectives at a central conclusion that is commonly shared. And as an ethicist, the question I get often asked is, what does this mean for public policy? Is this applicable? Can I do something with this argument? Which is a very relevant question, of course, and that's sort of how I'm trying to frame my talk and presentation today. Obviously, net zero in 2050, we are all familiar with that. We are aiming for net zero, including negative emissions, of course. And the more recent actual call, also by the European Climate Council, we are also repeating that call for the Netherlands from the Dutch Climate Council, is that it's not a linear decline. It has to be actually much steeper decline than linear, which means that in 2040, we have to start talking about 2040, not only look at 2050. In 2040, we have to be at 90 to 95% of decline of emissions, which means the challenge is even bigger than it used to be last year. So this brings a lot of importance, of course, behavioral options, but also technological options back to the table. And climate engineering is on that list, because obviously mitigation is going to be the gold standard. Mitigation and adaptation remain needed. Mitigation remains the gold standard for reaching that level of reduction of emissions. But at the same time, we need to also think about other options, both in terms of reducing the emissions. Negative emission is very important. CDR as a technology that we are going to talk on the panel more about. But at the same time, SRM, solar radiation management, I come back to the abbreviations if you're not familiar with it. Forgive me, I will come back to them in a minute. Solar radiation management is also very important, perhaps, or will be important perhaps in the coming decades. So let me talk a little bit about where the term geoengineering comes from. The term has been coined actually in the 1960s by an engineer talking about CDR, carbon dioxide removal. But the term got popular in 2009 when the Royal Society in the UK published a report on geoengineering, meaning intentional climate change. Some people interpret it as climate change for the better climate change, or intentional climate change, the right direction. But basically what it means, and this refers to still sort of the understanding that we need to stay below the 2 degrees Celsius as compared to 1990 levels. Nowadays we say 1.5, because we realize that it might be actually 2 degrees might be too far also. But basically, in order to stay within the limits, we need to consider different options. And the Royal Society, for the first time, sort of presented a definition, a sort of broad definition of geoengineering, and they categorized it in terms of the two technologies, being SRM, solar radiation management, solar radiation modification, different sort of terms have been used, and CDR, carbon dioxide removal technologies. So this is a very common overview of these technologies that you see here. I'm not going to sort of get into the details of these technologies, but one of the arguments I'm trying to defend today is that an ethical assessment should also include the technology. You should talk about the different technology, because ethics is not a generic assessment, but a sort of a more detailed assessment, and better understanding of technology will help us in doing so. From the very beginning, 2009, both the categories were actually super controversial, understandable, because we are dealing with the climatic system, unpredictable, systems that could change. If you change them in a specific way, might change in an unprecedented, unanticipated way, and large-scale modifications of the climate are very controversial, even though we have been doing that since the Industrial Revolution, you might say, but we have been doing it unintentionally. Doing it intentionally raises many, many concerns, definitely also ethically speaking. Yet, these days, we acknowledge that CDR, or carbon dioxide removal technologies, are needed, at least if we are to believe the most recent IPCC report on climate mitigation, in which for the first time CDR has been branded as, negative emission is not new, but CDR is on all the scenarios in which we stay at 1.5 degrees, so within the safe limits of the global temperature rise, a global average temperature rise. So CDR is acknowledged to be a necessity. 2009, 14 years later, 13 years later actually, last year the report got published, it moved from something very controversial to something that is acknowledged as highly necessary. This is not a normative judgment about the second category, it's just an acknowledgement. I'm just stating some facts about a quick historical review of where we come from. So CDR has been rebranded as negative emission. The term geoengineering is not being used for that. A new term emerged, solar geoengineering, because that only refers to SRM, or solar radiation management. I'm a little bit concerned about these developments because this brings us a little bit to sort of the binary ethics. Now CDR is the good one and SRM is the bad one. And that's exactly the type of ethics that I don't want to promote, because there is a lot more to say about both technologies from an ethics point of view. SRM brings about many uncertainties. The benefits could be substantial. As I said, it might be that in 10 years we arrive at a conclusion that unfortunately we don't manage to stay at the limits acceptable, and the global warming will continue, and we need to sort of start considering cooling down the Earth one way or the other. And especially imagine that the global temperature rise doesn't say about the local temperature rise, and in the cities the local temperature rise is substantially higher than the global mentioned here. So we might need to consider other options. And so this could, with using SRM, we could reduce the pace of climate change, the pace and the temperature of climate change, the pace of temperature rise, and doing it on a very, very large scale. Few people argue for that, but if you do it in a very large scale, you could also slow down the sea level rise, because basically it will have an effect on the global average temperature. But of course, risks are very high too, those could include substantial existential risks such as ozone depletion, droughts, negative impact on health and agriculture, and many, many more risks. And the most difficult issue is actually there are many unknowns, things that we do not know, because we know these technologies nowadays only from experiments, only from models and not from experiments. The current ethics of climate engineering, now moving to the actual more appropriate term, not geoengineering, but climate engineering, that as far as I'm concerned still includes both types of technologies, because we are intervening with the climatic system at a very large scale. At least that's what these technologies stand for. Current ethics of climate engineering is very often sort of in a rejective modus, and now talking about SRM, saying a categorical yes or a categorical no. Again, categorical yes are very few people in the world who say this categorical yes. People like David Keith, famous physicist in the US, who's also running major projects on it, who argue for the categorical implication or implementation of climate engineering and solar radiation management, but there are few in the world who argue sort of for this kind of categorical endorsement of SRM. there are many more people who actually say categorically no to the technology. And coming from sort of the risks that I mentioned, it is somewhat understandable. The first and I think still most important arguments in the literature was put forward by a climate ethicist, Steve Gardiner, who brought to the table the argument of moral hazard. So if you start offering a technological solution, it might slow down things such as mitigation, which could be a valid reason, but as far as I'm concerned, it's not a reason to say categorically no to climate engineering. It is a reason, it's a thing to address, one important issue to address, and there are many more than only that. So the argument moral hazard is sort of something that has come back to the literature abundantly, and it relates both to SRM and to CDR, because negative emission was also in the beginning years unpopular, because the argument was made that offering a solution for removing CO2 from the atmosphere would disincentivize actually not emitting CO2 to the atmosphere. Which still, if you look at the history of CDR, where we stand, if you look actually where the investments come from, very much a sort of genuine concern. You might have followed actually the discussions internationally that some colleagues, some academics actually last year, and many people from the policy world also endorsed the so-called non-use agreement on solar geoengineering. As I said, the term solar geoengineering emerged around that time, arguing that you need to put an international ban on any kind of application of solar geoengineering and the research thereof, because we don't know enough and it's not wise to start engaging with these kind of technologies. While the reasons they mention, the concerns they mention, are actually most of them I would also absolutely agree with, I wouldn't arrive at the same conclusion. And I think I'm not alone in that. Many others have also arrived at different conclusions, share the concerns, but arriving at different conclusions. For instance, people who have written a call for balance, and a colleague who has actually initiated that, Matthias, is here and will be with me on the panel after the talk. So the call for balance basically says that you need to do experiments in order to understand the governance issues. You can't separate the governance and experiment from each other, and all the knowledge we have about the technology right now comes from the models. We know very little based on actual sort of real-world experiments with these technologies. Another important development was actually the National Academies of Science and Engineering and Medicine in the US published research on SRM, a report on SRM research and the governance thereof. Again, there is a lot of focus on the governance of solar radiation management also in Europe. There are several projects. The Co-Create project that I'm sure Matthias will introduce to you after in the panel session that talk about the governance. But now the biggest challenge is actually how do we tie the governance arguments into the actual experimentation, and to what extent do we accept their experimentation, because you need to also start thinking about the ethics of experimentation. That's also not something that is categorically allowed. We need to sort of subject the experimentation to some kind of ethical argumentation, and that is sort of where hopefully this argument could enter and have a contribution. The last development internationally speaking that I want to mention here is actually the report published by the Climate Overshoot Commission, September 2023, actually 2 months ago. And basically, this report is repeating what a call for balance says, or merging the two calls. On the one side, it says we need to have an international ban on implementation, large-scale implementation. This is not something you should consider doing now. On the other side, it opens the door entirely actually for research, because it says we need to understand technology based on actual experiments and research in the field. The latter might still be very controversial, because every attempt to do research has been unsuccessful until now for various reasons, but there are no good examples of good research. So what I believe that could be the ethics of climate engineering, let me call it ethics of climate engineering 2.0, is following the risk versus risk framework. Because on the one side, the whole idea of presenting SRM to the table was sort of based on we could avoid unprecedented harm, we could avoid irreversible harm. So we need to consider certain technologies that could help us with that. But it could also cause very serious risks too, serious and irreversible risks too, if you do it in a not very wise way, or if you would be encountered with unanticipated unknown risks. So the risk versus risk framework, for which I'm not claiming any originality by the way, various authors have written on that, I'm quoting actually their work, but I think the risk versus risk framework could also be very valuable for the ethical assessment. So we could say that this is an ethics of risk versus risk framework that we could help us here, because in the ethical assessment, we cannot do a one-off assessment. This is a longitudinal assessment. This is something that we need to consider, and we need to do it in iteration. So this is very much also in line with argumentations in sustainable research and innovation, as very, very popular at the EU level, but also thinking in ethics of technology, ethics for design, as this particular project is working on, or design for values. So you need to have considered sort of certain ethical assessment in the longitudinal assessment. What does that mean, and what will be the problems that we'll come across? From an ethical point of view, I think we cannot do that without considering normative uncertainties. Normative uncertainties are there are issues in which, or moments in which we are encountered with an ethical issue to which you could respond in a different way. So there will be different partially acceptable ethical responses to an ethical quandary, and there is not only one way of dealing with it. So it's actually basically arguing for the non-binary ethical assessment that doesn't arrive at a red sign or a green sign, but helps you to get much more into the details of what ethics stands for and what ethical reasoning we could sort of follow. Here is actually sort of a tentative taxonomy of normative uncertainties that we have developed together with some colleagues. It's broader than climate engineering. It's about climate risk, mostly about adaptation. But I do believe that some of this taxonomy might be helpful to better understand the ethical issues of climate engineering. I'm not going to bore you with the definitions, but I'm going to zoom into two of these and relate to climate engineering. I'm going to talk about evolutionary normative uncertainty and conceptual normative uncertainty. What are those? Evolutionary normative uncertainty emphasizes that it might be unclear which ethical norm would apply in the future to a certain situation creating technological risk. I will just stop for a second.
It's your past is
So evolutionary uncertainty. We are dealing actually sort of with the evolution of technology, and we are dealing with evolution of morality. Both of them need to be considered because technology and scientific knowledge will continue to evolve, gladly so. We start developing, we understand technology better, we develop our scientific insight and knowledge, and morality and understanding what is good will also evolve in society. So this argument builds on the line of reasoning changing values as presented by my colleague Ivo van der Poel from TU Delft, but also in broader in the STS literature, what is called the technomoral change. So basically this argument fits in that line of reasoning. Let me sort of sidestep and give an example from the nuclear technology to explain what I mean by evolutionary normative uncertainties. It's about 60 years after the first commercial use of nuclear technology that we are thinking about the disposal of nuclear waste. And again, if you look back 60 years up until now, you could argue easily that the technology has evolved substantially. For instance, we understand radiation risk differently. In the first days of radiation protection, we had a very deterministic approach to radiation. So it's below this threshold is good, everything above that threshold is bad. So again, the binary assessment moved to more stochastic assessments or probabilistic assessments. So the likelihood of being exposed to radiation would increase certain diseases in the future. So it's a much more refined way of looking at radiation risks, which caused that we reconsidered our radioactive waste management approaches, which means basically that we do not dump our waste into the sea. On the bottom of North Sea, there is a lot of barrels still, low-level waste, but that was based on the idea that the oceans are big enough, they will dilute. A bit of radiation wouldn't hurt. Well, we have reconsidered that, gladly so again. So our understanding of radiation risk has sort of evolved, and we have developed new technologies for instance, further deactivating the lifetime of nuclear waste. So it's basically somewhere between 200,000 years and 1,000,000 years, and we could bring that back to 10,000 years, even bring that further back to 1,000 years, which is still a tremendously long period of time, but is substantially shorter than 1,000,000 years, which is 5 times longer than the lifetime of our species as Homo sapiens. So basically, again, the science evolved, technology evolved, but also morality has evolved in the last 60 years. 60 years, the term sustainability barely existed, perhaps in the German-speaking literature as a term. But nowadays, sustainability is a cornerstone of a lot of public policy. So based on this, you could say that if you would have sort of developed thinking about nuclear waste based on knowledge and where knowledge, technology, and morality stood 60 years ago, we would have been somewhere completely different. So this is what what I call normative or evolutionary normative uncertainties. What does that mean for geoengineering? If you now compare this to geoengineering, A lot of proposals that are being presented nowadays are things that need perhaps 1 or 2 decades of science and developments, experimentation and developments. And when you start carrying them out, they will probably be carried out over a longer period of time. This is not a one-off thing that you do and you stop doing. In many proposals, for instance, if you're familiar with the technology, stratospheric aerosol injection is something that needs to continuously be done, probably. Which means that we are dealing with a longer period of time. And again, we cannot have a one-off ethical assessment, static ethical assessment now. We need some kind of longitudinal and recurring or iterative ethical assessment of the technology. So the time lag between the first envisioning of the technology, which is Paul Crutzen paper, early 2000, for the first time he started sort of, the comparison was not for the first time, but he proposed that what if we start mimicking volcanoes? So we could sort of make sure that some of the radiations from the sun doesn't reach the earth, and by that we could sort of cool down the earth a little bit. So the first envisioning of the technology in the actual application and implementation, there is at least a couple of decades of time lag. The second category of normative uncertainties that I'd like to discuss, and I promise to wrap it up after that, is conceptual normative uncertainty. It is an instance of uncertainty when it is unclear which concept will apply, or a certain moral concepts could be interpreted, or different concepts could be prioritized differently. What does that mean? Let me give an example from justice, a notion that comes back in a lot of public policy discussions. And what does that justice exactly mean? To whom does justice accrue? At which moment and in which country, and at what moments in the future? So all of that are important information that feed into the notion of justice and could help us to arrive at different understandings of justice. So it doesn't take much persuasion to argue that justice matters in climate policies. I believe you also mentioned, Mr. TechEthos mentioned in his opening words that climate justice or justice in our thinking about future technologies is a cornerstone of a lot of actually public policy. But how does justice feature in these policies exactly? And that is where things become much more interesting. Because think about, for instance, the term energy justice, again, a term that has popularized over the last 10 years. What does that exactly mean, justice in terms of distributions or procedure, or justice as recognition or restorative justice? All these sort of tenets of justice that are floating around in the literature. And each of them, if you look at the literature, we have actually recently done, mostly Nienke van Uffelen, a PhD student at our university that is graduating, actually getting her PhD on energy justice and normative uncertainties next year. She has done a beautiful, actually, sort of overview of the literature by seeing that the term justice has been used in a lot of that literature, but sort of interpreted only, used only in a colloquial way. So like by way of intuitively, this is justice, a fairness issue that matters, or by interpreting it one specific interpretation. As we know, public policy is strongly utilitarian. So a lot of discussions on justice is about actually the greatest good approaches, basically. Why a utilitarian and a sufficientarian would arrive at substantially different conclusions in terms of distribution of resources. So if we say that distributive justice matters, we haven't yet said what kind of approach, what principle of distribution we apply. And that principle of distribution is going to matter in the actual conclusion of public policy. And even we say it explicitly or not, some kind of choice have been made in public policy. So these choices are often made actually implicitly. And what we have tried to do here is actually to make those choices more explicit, because that is needed and that contributes to better transparency of public policy and being more clear on what justice exactly means, and more broadly speaking, what ethics of energy and climate policy actually mean. So the call that I want to actually present here to this table, I'd love to hear your comments on that, is a call for dynamic ethics assessment. Because by doing this ethical assessment dynamically, we could evaluate and re-evaluate the ethical acceptability of research on geoengineering. Because again, I'm emphasizing research on geoengineering. A lot of ethics of geoengineering is on the actual application. We need to start thinking about the research thereof and the ethics of research and the governance of geoengineering. It could also help us to better account for the scientific and technical uncertainties, as well as the unknowns and unknown unknowns. So this brings in a different approach that helps us to longitudinally look at the ethical assessment. And it could also help us to better deal with the societal uncertainties. The issue of moral hazard that I mentioned earlier. So doing or considering even to do some kind of new technology could sort of help us divert public policy and and public funding from actual research or actual development of climate mitigation approaches, reduction of emission, what is the cornerstone of reaching the net zero, actually. So this also helps us to look at it from a societal perspective. Doing research on carrying out small-scale experiments on SRM, is that going to divert the attention from mitigation? If so, that might be a reason to actually stop that research, because the thing that matters most is to not emit rather than to help cool down. The longitudinal assessment or the dynamic ethical assessment could help us to better deal with or go beyond the yes-no assessment. As I said, short recap of my talk could be ethics beyond the yes-no stalemates. So this could help us to go beyond the yes-no stalemates, and it could also help us to discriminate between different technologies. A lot of arguments in the literature on the ethics of SRM have to do with the so-called stratospheric aerosol injections. The reason is that it's fairly easy to do. We just need a couple of planes, basically, and need to have things that could fly in the stratosphere, and you spray some kind of spray, probably sulfur dioxide, into the stratosphere, and that could help to sort of reflect back some of the sunlight. Yet I believe that is not the most likely thing that could happen, or the one that we should consider most. I think perhaps marine cloud brightening, the other approach to, and again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to elaborate on these technologies. We could come back to that if needed in the Q&A session. But I think that it could be very beneficial to go beyond the yes-no assessments and to be able to discriminate between different technological approaches, both for SRM and for CDR. It could also bring the focus of ethics and governance to the ethics and governance of research, as I mentioned, because the research on these technologies is the thing that matters most at this moment, because almost no one is arguing for implementation. A dynamic ethical assessment could also be considered some kind of belief revision on the basis of new factual evidence. If we bring in new insights, it could also help us to sort of reconsider our ethical beliefs. And that is also what is captured here by the notion of normative uncertainties. I think I'm going to leave it at that. This is a presentation actually, sorry that I'm promoting a different consortium here, but our consortium Ethics of Socially Disruptive Technologies, and Dominic and I are actually sitting on. And final promotional slide, and I stop. This is a book that we are particularly proud of because this is written in a very inclusive fashion. This is a book written with almost 20 people, including many young researchers. And this is sort of a quick recap of the work of the consortium Ethics of Socially Disruptive Technologies. And Dominic and I actually sort of were leading a chapter on what is it called? Climate engineering and the future of justice. So it's open access and very inclusive, and that's what makes us be particularly proud of the book. Let me leave it at that. Thank you very much for your attention.
That was terrific, Behnam. Thank you so much. And if you're watching online and you want to submit a question, do please put one in the chat, and it will be picked up by Bennett. Where's Bennett? Bennett's going to pick it up. So I'm going to ask actually a very similar question to the one I asked Laura before, which is about time. Because we may be forced into, because what we're seeing is climate change accelerating in a way that perhaps we had not anticipated. I mean, looking at the current sea temperatures, looking at the current polar ice, all of those kind of things are going much, much more quickly. So we may be forced into doing things that are between two things, the less bad alternative, which speaks to your dynamics. So is that a strong argument, do you think, behind adopting this kind of approach?
That's a very good question. I think it's one of the sort of perhaps running assumptions behind what I'm arguing here for. Because we might be forced to choose for certain technologies, even though everybody I've spoken to would consider them undesirable at this moment. But we might be sort of forced into those situations. So that is sort of the assumption that brings me to the conclusion we need to actually start the experiment as fast as possible, because we need to better understand what's at stake here, better understand short-term consequences, long-term consequences, and we know actually next to nothing about the actually real-world applications of these technologies. So once we are forced with them, with the option of one bad versus the other bad, and that's a risk versus risk framework basically, I would love to make that choice based on a lot more and better knowledge and empirically founded knowledge rather than things that we know from the models.
Thoughts from you? Sir, tell us who you are.
Yes, Michel Bobin from the University of Twente, also a member of TechEthos. Thank you very much for the very clear presentation. I had a question about this notion of evolutionary normative uncertainty. I think it's very important to discuss about uncertainty when we discuss about risk. We cannot avoid doing that. But I was wondering if there are not certain factors that would mitigate this kind of uncertainty. So, for instance, it's very likely that future people will want to have their basic entitlement, like very fundamental rights or interests, protected. I don't think that would fall under any form of uncertainty, whether it's empirical and normative. So I think when we speak about protecting people from risks, including the risk of climate engineering technologies, we can go beyond the excuse or argument of uncertainty to say, but we already have enough certainties to know that some effects of geoengineering will affect some very basic entitlement of people. So I think this could be used as a way to mitigate the kind of uncertainty you discuss.
Michel, the short answer to your question is I couldn't agree more. So the term uncertainty has been misused and abused in public policy, especially by climate skeptics a lot. So it's uncertain, we don't know it. But that's how science works, first of all. Science thrives on disagreements. That's not my statement. That goes back to Robert Merton, how defined science in 1940s. So we disagree with each other, we build on knowledge, and we that's how science progresses. And I also agree that not all kind of normativity is subject to normative uncertainties. Absolutely agree that basic needs, basic entitlements, protecting human rights, those things need to be there. Access to water, access to food, access to clean air. What I say is that there are certain things that might change, that might sort of make us want to reconsider our public policy. Public policy 20 years ago didn't account for ecosystems or animals at all. Nowadays, the non-anthropocentric approaches are becoming more and more leading, at least in Europe. So that is what I call normative uncertainty. That is called evolutionary normative uncertainty, because we are acknowledging more and more the role of, for instance, that animals and ecosystems play, not for the interest of humans, but for the sake of themselves. So this is what I call normative uncertainty, but that's not an argument for any kind of normativity subjected to uncertainty, and it is absolutely not an argument to say that, well, we are not certain, so let's stop development or let's stop action. Very well aware of that argument in public policy.
And there are going to be some big issues about power dynamics here, aren't there? Because it's the countries who have the scientific and technical knowledge and the funding that can produce some of these technologies, but actually it may be the least advantaged, say, in the global south who are... But even so, if it came to a very difficult situation, the people with the money would still trump it. And I use
the last
word.
bit of your sentence, that's I don't know if the pun was intended or not.
Yes.
But I think the last one is indeed the very important issue, because you were saying that in the previous panel that on AI technologies we might actually sort of nation states are becoming less and less relevant. Same goes here. My biggest worry right now is actually that sort of big tech will take over these kind of technologies. It would be out of public hands. So because some people argue for not putting public fundings into research. On the one side, I do understand, because the argument is public funding should go as much as possible to mitigation efforts. But on the other side, I'm very much worried, and the worry was sort of only theoretical, you could say, until a couple of months ago. But a development, two entrepreneurs in the US started developing, what was it now? Creating sunsets? Making sunset, thank you very much. So basically the idea was that they make balloons with some kind of particles in it, that they put it up into the stratosphere, that's a claim, and they make it blow there, and by that they sell cooling credits. First I thought that's actually a call for research, we need to take this technology seriously, but then I realized there was actually a whole business model developed around it. So you can't sort of, are you worried about your carbon emissions? Come and buy cooling credit with us, we offset that. And that is exactly the moral hazard argument that people have been warning for. And if especially these things will be in hand of non-public players, that's when we become dependent on the Elon Musks of this world 20 years from now.
I thought you were going to say that actually it was an Instagram thing, that they were creating sunsets in order to get people to get the perfect sunset always on Instagram.
I actually once got a phone call from a journalist, and I said that it's probably actually a joke, but it's a good joke. But then sending actually interviews with them in Newsweek, I said, no, this is not a joke at all. There is a whole business model around this. And this is indeed actually, these are the developments that make people call for a ban on everything.
Yeah. And as we were saying before, not only are there bad actors, but there's also huge amounts of money sloshing around the system for this kind of blue skies type of thing. If it's mad enough, there'll be some tech entrepreneur will fund it.
I mean, look at who's funding CDR at this moment. The other technology. A lot of funding is coming from public funders, the fossil industry also. Yeah. So that is again the worry, is that it would be out of public hands. It would be out of actually public control in public hands, and the money will be actually leading. That is the power dynamic that I'm much more concerned about, the nation state's power dynamic, which is absolutely a valid point also in any kind of climate policy. Look at the history of the COPs. In every kind of climate conference of parties agreements, most recently in Egypt, that was sort of a victory for developing countries because it brought the loss and damage fund to the table. But there is this power dynamic comes back at the international level all the time. And this is the international nation-state power dynamic, and there is going to be an absolutely sort of money power dynamics also.
Dominic.
Yeah, just to add on to this. So the other thing to mention about that. Thanks. The other thing to mention about that making
this is Dominic Lindsay,
sorry. Was that they went to do it in Mexico, right? These like American guys were like, well, where's somewhere that we don't care about the consequences, or we think there's no regulation, so we're going to just do it in Mexico. And so that's the kind of, if there's a governance gap, we can expect that kind of thing to be happening across the board, where weaker jurisdictions are kind of taken advantage of there.
Okay, I'm going to take two more quick questions. One at the back there. Tell me who you are, sir.
I'm Peter Vermaas from TechEthos, from TU Delft, colleague of Benham. I have a question about the dynamic ethical assessment which you propose. I was wondering, how can you avoid that this leads to a delay in an ethical assessment? I can consider, the idea that a couple of ethicists are thinking about it. And we just say, okay, we'll continue thinking. Go on. We have you. It's kind of ethics washing. Where would you? How do you see ethics that bites within your model?
It's a very good question, Peter. Thank you very much. I think in this specific case, I'm not very much worried about ethics delaying things because the technological developments are going on. I think I'm much more worried that ethicists are lagging behind, that we need to make sure that we tag along actually the scientific and technological developments. And a lot of that is already happening, which is a good thing. But again, as I said, a lot of it is happening based on the models and information that we have on the models. Having said that, I do understand and acknowledge the sort of inherent risk of talking about ethics, putting philosophers in charge. We talk a lot, and we talk long. And then using that as an argument in terms of actually, so there is no need for action. And again, we see a difficult and dangerous parallel here with nuclear waste disposal that I mentioned earlier. It's a consistently recurring argument that if we wait 10 years longer, there is better technology. Let's postpone it. The Netherlands, the country that both of are based in, has decided to dispose of its nuclear waste in 2120. Because, well, we still need to consider and have public consultations, technology will be much better, and between the lines, if you read carefully, it's a small producing country, so it counts on some kind of European disposal for nuclear waste, because it's possible according to European regulations these days. So, and that is constantly sort of used as some kind of not only ethics, but also the fact that technology is not advanced enough. But we need to also think and consider about the ethics. So we should definitely make sure that that doesn't happen in this case. But here, I don't think that it will be postponed because we might need the technology much faster. I'm actually much worried that ethics will stay behind because we need to develop. So we don't have time for sort of reflections and talking about the ethics. So we move too fast with the technological development. That's what I think, that this dynamic ethical assessment that should start from the very scratch of thinking and experimenting. And I think that could actually both enrich the development and perhaps guide the direction of the development.
So, yeah. So we've got another question. Was there anything online? Okay.
Microphone's on, okay. Vincent Maynard from AIT, also working in TechEthos, and I wanted to come back to the question, or to the short discussion that was happening before, with a short comment, because I like the discussion about whether or not private companies or private funding should go into the development of climate engineering, because it touches upon an issue that I think is often overseen when doing ethical reflections of technology, namely the question of the business model. And of course, this needs to be addressed somehow, and often I think it's because philosophers or sociologists are usually only looking at the technology and what kind of impact it might have. And I wonder, there would be a question here, because I was also asked this question recently and I didn't have an answer, so I would just give it on to you and see what you think. What would be an ethical, just business model surrounding climate engineering? Because on the one hand, we can see that we need private funding, otherwise the research will not go fast enough. So yeah, I think the question is here. What do you think, if you have any thoughts on that?
So if you knew of an ethical business model, just write it down. We'll pass it round.
Thank you very much for that question. Thank you for the not so very difficult question. I'm going to answer actually broader than only climate engineering, because we do need private funding for a lot of actually climate challenges. I'm not arguing here putting only public funding into these issues, because then public resources will run out and will dry out and we'll have difficulties on other accounts. I have recently learned myself, I was not aware of that, because every time talking about private funding, I was always worried about, okay, there is this interest of profit maximization, etc., etc. That's one way of thinking about business. New business need to also think about, they call it actually ethical business models themselves. It's not all kind of business is based on profit maximization. Some businesses acknowledge these days, and more so, that you need to have sort of a social responsibility as well. Of course, there is a private interest. Of course, you put your money and you want to increase your money. That is not inherently wrong, as long as the social responsibility issue is clear there. And on the background of these developments are similar examples with the corporate social responsibility discussions, for instance. Again, these are things I've recently actually been reading on and learned about. And I think this is much more than only thinking in terms of charity. I think this is an acknowledgement. The fact that private parties are doing this is an acknowledgement. They see that this is going to be their future survival. 10, 15 years from now, we as consumers, perhaps societies at large, we will be acknowledging actually the companies that are going beyond only the interest of stakeholders, only the interest of their shareholders. Those are the ones that could survive. So I take that as a positive sign. And I think that there is actually ample literature on this issue that I wasn't aware of myself in business ethics. There is ample literature on actually ethical business, and what does that mean beyond the neoclassical approaches to business models.
So it's on a grand scale that, there are companies called community interest groups. You could have much, much bigger kind of enterprises, which would be social enterprises, not-for-profit.
It could even be for profit, but it could also acknowledge, it could even be for profit. It's a business could be for profit, but it could acknowledge social responsibility. And the core business of those businesses is not to make money or to increase money. So it has several sort of aims, and one of those aims is actually sort of to comply with the social responsibility of that business.
Okay, very good. Is that one more question online? I have a question. It's got to be very brief, because we must break now. But
so I'm Bennett Francis, UT. I just wanted to ask whether you thought that there could be a danger that the idea of dynamic ethics assessment fails to leave space for politics, and Vivian keeps coming back to the idea of deliberation. Is there a danger that what you're doing there is you're depoliticizing the question? You're saying, let's find a compromise position whereby we don't have to say yes or no, but then what you're doing then is you're kind of technically defining what the compromise position is in a way that it gets around the need for political deliberation, when perhaps what you should be doing is just embracing that deliberation and conflict is really the only option in this kind of situation.
I think that's got to be a brief answer.
I will try my best. I'm not sure if I agree that I'm depoliticizing, and because the issues that you raise, I agree with. And I think that what I'm arguing here for is much more a process of deliberation is needed, and politics will remain absolutely relevant in the whole decision making. And I'm also not arguing for reaching a consensus here per se. It's much more flagging what matters to the technological developments and raising the important ethical issues. So as we know in applied ethics consensus, the thinking about in terms of overlapping consensus or consensus more broadly speaking as sort of the ideal world in ethics that doesn't exist. At the end of the day, on the background is indeed the political dynamics and that will play into the whole development. So I do agree with your statements. I'm not sure if my arguments actually sort of, that's a critique to the argument that I'm presenting, because I think that's again something that we should be aware of, rather than that it would sort of neutralize the ethical assessment, the dynamic ethical assessment I'm trying to present here.
Okay, now you can argue that between you over the coffee break, which we're now going to have. This is only the briefest of pit stops while we reset for our panel session in a moment. Benham, thank you so much for setting that all up for us.
Thank you.
Okay, so we had that terrific overview of green transition and ethics from Benham. Now what we're going to do is have a panel discussion, but at the beginning of the panel, Dominic Lindsay, who's one of the TechEthos partners, is going to outline what's been done in this specific area by TechEthos. But let me introduce the panel to you. You've already met Benham. You've already heard through his questions from Dominic Lindsay. Can I introduce with great pleasure Dushan Hanek?
Perfect.
Who's principal advisor in the DG for climate action, and particularly principal advisor the digital for green transition. So you have a very important role to play, and I'm delighted you're with us. Thank you so much. Matthias Honegger. Matthias comes from Perspectives at Climate Research and leads the Climate Policy Research Group there, focusing on the governance of carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification, which is very handy because those are both the things we're going to be discussing. Okay, so Dominic, over to you first of all for an overview of what TechEthos has been doing in this. Yes, that's a good idea.
Thank you, Benham. Yeah, so it's my pleasure to introduce some of the key policy messages and ethics messages from the project that we've been working on in the last couple of years, so especially the last year and a bit of this project. And I'll just say a little bit too briefly on how we approached this work in the consortium. So we used an anticipatory ethics method that was further developed by members of the consortium, with a couple of key components here. So a future orientation, it's very important for anticipating future developments, and also a focus on developing evaluation frameworks and methodologies. On our TechEthos website, there's further information about this, and there's a couple of deliverables you might be interested in. For methodology, it's deliverable 5.1, and for ethics frameworks, 5.3. Okay. So that's a little bit of background, and I'm in a great position to talk about the policy messages we have in the project because Benham's just introduced these technologies for us very nicely. So I don't have to make a big distinction here. One thing I would just say, and it came up a bit in the discussion, is that especially in our policy messages, we wanted to make a big distinction between carbon removal and solar radiation modification or management, and not, as far as possible, not to run these things together. So the ethics brought up by these different technologies look quite different. The governance challenges are very specific, even within the category. So we are recommending care in not bundling these things together, especially looking at governance. So one of the big concerns in this literature for CDR is the moral hazard problem that Benham already introduced. Having this as an available technology, even in a model, not a real technology, might make mitigation slower. This has been a concern for a very long time. I'm not going to comment on the extent to which it has already had an effect, but it's still an operative concern. Another very standard concern is for unjust distribution of costs and harms. These can be of various kinds. They can also be garden variety economic effects, so equity effects. Particularly with carbon removal, the role of carbon majors, the fossil fuel sector, is quite important, and I'll come back to that in a little while. Probably the most discussed issue in the literature is about potential side effects of doing CDR. which are all based on the scale at which you would do this. Now, I should say, not all technologies in this group raise all of these concerns, and not all to the same extent. So it's very important to look at the details here. But prominent concerns when implemented in standard mitigation scenarios do raise these concerns with biodiversity, food security, water, and so on. And finally, public participation, where to do it, which technologies to choose, and so on. These are quite fundamental questions. So our governance recommendations are kind of following up from where a lot of these ethical points end. So we think it's going to be very important going forward to clarify a couple of EU principles that bear on carbon removal, as well as other green transition policies. So the do no significant harm principle and the leave no one behind principle, which are both distributive justice equity principles. So what do these mean for doing CDR and doing it in the Eurozone? It's quite important that we work this out. There's another important principle in the climate space. This is an old one, the common but differentiated responsibilities principle. This is for countries to work out, well, in theory, how they would mitigate and adapt to climate change in a fair way, counting history, counting differences in wealth, and so on. It also would apply to CDR, but it's not clear what it means. So it's important to think about this. Related to that, as I said before, is the role of the fossil fuel sector. They've obviously played a large role in causing climate change. What is their responsibility now with respect to carbon removal? And also there's a group within carbon removal called so-called nature-based technologies. There's the EU biodiversity strategy for 2030. There's a new nature law that just passed the other day. So there are probably going to be some implications that we need to work out for how to do this sustainably within the Eurozone and beyond. Okay, so as I said, I made a big distinction here, but some of the ethical issues for SRM will overlap to some extent, at least the concepts, but the application will look different. So the moral hazard concern comes up again. And for various, I think for fairly straightforward reasons that Bennett also, that Benham also outlined, that the availability of a technology that would slow down climate change could be politically quite dangerous. Distribution of harms looks different for this group of technologies. So a main worry in the literature here is weather modification, which harms potentially harms agricultural conditions and vulnerable communities across the world. So it's very important we understand this one, which I think was in also the call for more research to understand what the effects might actually be of weather modification, if any. Procedural justice is perhaps even worse in this space, and it's one of the more discussed issues on SRM. So if we take a standard principle like the all-affected principle, how would we apply this in the case of SRM, where the all-affected would probably include everyone on Earth, at least conceivably? And finally, as we heard a lot about, this group of technologies is still at a basic research phase. The governance of research is therefore very important, and it's a major theme in this space. So, our recommendations in this space would be firstly to clarify what counts as doing SRM research, what counts as doing field testing and deployment. There are these phrases like deployment with a scientific basis that need clarification to be applied. Following up on something we heard about looking at SRM research with a risk framework, this is definitely something that we think needs to be looked at and developed from a precautionary angle. However, it's important to think about this grounded by ethical minimum standards and sustainability standards. So it shouldn't be a kind of unbounded risk comparison here, which could be quite dangerous. SRM research should be accountable. It should be based on international partnerships that are representative. What we heard a lot about, it should factor in justice norms, political legitimacy, right? So this shouldn't be something added in at the end. This should be something meaningfully included at the research stage. And finally, knowledge sharing, communication, and also, at least for one of these technologies, a limitation on the acquisition of intellectual property rights, which really we think could be quite dangerous in this space. So those are some of the highlights from the project, and basically, hopefully, to get us going in the discussion, there are a few themes to pick up on. So, yeah, that's it.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So, Dushan, let's come to you first. What are your thoughts on the and reflections on what Dominic has just said?
Actually, our thoughts, they are going also in this direction, and not only thoughts, but also steps. And I'm glad to be here today because I think that in the future we are going to be in contact much more, also in framework of co-create project that is going to work on governments of research in the EU. But coming back, I started to work on this issue some months ago, and really what we would like to do to involve as many experts, scientists, researchers, not only on technology, but also on ethics, in order to have a better view and to find better policies. So we know that this is a really sensitive issue, that there are many risks, known and possibly unknown, and there are many aspects, not only physical, but also societal, political issues. And if we do things really in haste and not having accurate framework, we can do more harm. And maybe technology could be developed, but without political support of people, it would be difficult to go ahead. And this is like issue that it's subject also to disinformation. For a moment, people in general, they don't know a lot. But if they receive only message that it's extremely dangerous, that could lead to harm to the planet, to the people, they would refuse it immediately. And in our... Yes.
But what about Benham's central point, which was that you need to be thinking about this stuff because in the end, you may be forced to do something as a kind of last ditch. Let's hope we don't go there, but as a last ditch, and you need to have done the research in advance in order to find out.
Yeah, definitely. But I have to underline that for us, solar radiation modification is not a solution to climate change, because it works on temperature. It's not working on the main reason for climate warming, for global warming, and this is increase greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, so high concentration, and it's more working on the results, so global warming on temperature. So it could provide only a temporary relief, not real cure. So what we have to do is really focus mainly on mitigation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions everywhere, to adapt, because we already have negative impacts of climate change everywhere, and we need to adapt. So there are two main priorities, mitigation and adaptation. But we know that we cannot remove all greenhouse gases completely, so we need to have also carbon removal technologies. So to remove carbon, preferably with nature-based solutions, but also with technological solutions. And there are different technologies. Some of them, they are globally accepted. Also IPCC highlighted that we will need carbon removal in order to be climate neutral. Some technologies, mainly ocean-based, like ocean fertilization, are not accepted at all. Some there are still like discussion how to do it, like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. But nature-based solutions and also technological solutions, so direct air carbon capture with storage, that's something that it's acceptable, and we are working on it. So coming back to solar radiation modification, personally, I think that we need to really distinguish these two technologies. Direct carbon capture, so direct air capture, and solar radiation modification. They work on different bases, and also risks are different. And we are working on solar radiation modification. We also identified as a risk, and in June, the Commission and High Representative for Foreign Policy published joint communication highlighting that solar radiation modification is a risk, and we committed to work on international assessment, so to work on international level, and also like work on governance of research and possible or potential deployment. So we are doing that internationally and in the EU. And in the EU, former Executive Vice President Timmermans asked a high-level group of scientific advisors to deliver assessment. So in 1 year, we will have assessment on scientific part, and also we are thinking to ask high-level group on ethics to have more focused assessment of ethical aspects. So that's for us extremely important, and in that way we count on support also from One Horizon Europe project, co-create, and Matthias is leading, working on governments of research. And we could have a better assessment and also ideas in which direction to go, how to manage research and potential deployment, and also what to propose on international level, because discussion is ongoing on international level.
And it's something that we can't ever do by ourselves.
Yes, definitely, because this is also international issue, and we need an inclusive process. So not only to have people from highly developed countries and the best universities, but also to involve scientists from global south, and also to communicate, because this is an issue that is a little bit hidden. So it's not in general public knowledge of policymakers, neither of people. And information is crucial. Okay. Also for the social and ethical reasons.
Okay, thank you. Matthias, your reflections now.
Thanks. So I'll gladly speak a few words on the topic of co-create, the project that has been mentioned several times, but I'd like to start by taking a step back and asking, what is the starting point of this conversation? Why do we consider both carbon dioxide removal and this even more outlandish idea of intervening in the climate system by putting, for example, aerosols in the stratosphere to reflect sunlight? I mean, how crazy is that?
So kind of Bruce Willis, isn't it?
It kind of is.
Yes.
And so what got us here? And the fact of the matter is that these are thoughts of a desperate situation. I really have to emphasize that. It's not, in comparison to this morning's discussion, it's not that we're considering a technological development for entertainment, or even though there are also medical applications saving lives, in this case it's really about the state of the climate system and our foundation of life on this planet. We are virtually certain to surpass 1.5 degrees. There's no doubt about that. And we're likely to surpass 2 degrees of warming. And those of us who are looking into the science of this are frankly terrified. So it is a domain of desperation in some sense, but it's also a domain that we therefore cannot leave away in our considerations. And I very much underline what has been said in the sense that if and when we get to a point where that really bubbles up on political agenda as a serious option, now I'm talking really in particular about SRM, we really want to be in a position where we have smart minds from all over the planet come together and try to jointly figure out what this would mean. Because if we don't, then it's much more likely to be something of a fast and cheap and easy shot that some, not to point out a particular country per se, but the likes of a few Pentagon decision makers will come together and take a decision on. I think that's what we clearly want to avoid. Rather, we want to see this, and this is particularly my motivation to be engaged, we want to see this in the public realm as much as possible, a shared thought process subject to the forces of democracy and not to a small handful of people who have just had merely had the amount of time that it takes to understand the basic concept of what this could be. Because really we don't know what it is. We are only in the process of figuring out what this type of intervention could be, starting from the very basic scientific questions all the way to the very social and ethical dimensions of this problem. So that's my starting point, and this is where I was super happy and encouraged to see the call for a research, for a coordination and support action from the Commission that is, in my mind, really trying to fill this gap that we have before us, which is a big uncertainty whether and how doing applied or out-of-doors research on this topic is desirable, can be meaningful, including with a view to prevent rogue or unilateral or otherwise undesired action elsewhere. Because I think this is part of the necessary process, is figuring out on a global level and in cooperation globally what this is, what it could look like, and how we as a global community should address it and deal with it. So this is co-create, building some elements of governance for experiments in the European context, but also hopefully with relevance beyond Europe.
Thank you. I was going to ask Benham a bit more about corporate capture, because this is something that actually could equally apply to AI, and applies to all sorts of emerging technologies, and particularly with, fossil fuel companies, that they have extraordinary lobbying power. I don't know, when you go to COP, kind of half the delegates are from fossil fuels backgrounds. How you get over that, because they will argue for their stranded assets, for all those kind of things. What would you like to see?
Specifically about the COPs, or?
Well, no, not in relation to COP, but in particular IP and.
I think I very much agree actually with the call that Dominic was presenting, and on behalf of this consortium, that you need to be very careful in terms of the IP rights. Yeah. Who's going to apply and who's going to be actually sort of get granted those IP rights, because that could very much determine that's going to be the new discussion on oil as it was in 1970s and 1980s perhaps. So those might be specific individuals, companies, countries that could sort of lead the whole development internationally. So I think it would make sense that those IPs will be granted to perhaps compilation of countries. So public, I would argue for public granting of those IPs rather than private owners, but also a compilation of countries like, and I think EU is I know it's not a very favorable message nowadays in EU to say we have elections coming up next week in the Netherlands, but he was a very interesting and successful experiment of a compilation of numerous countries that are jointly actually governing each other. So I think I would be a big fan of actually coordinating action in EU and sort of making sure that the EU could play a major leading role in the development of research, but also in perhaps development of international sort of thinking about these IP rights, who gets to develop and how should be developed, how should be governed, and of course eventually it needs to be at the level of the EU of the United Nations, where also these dynamics and power dynamics and all the discussions that we know and the veto rights of specific countries come to play. But I do think that right now I was very happily surprised actually learning about the Co-Create project, because it puts the EU at exactly right position. This is something that I've been trying to argue for, that EU should take a leading role in these developments rather than sitting on the back seat and say that, well, this is controversial, we are not touching the subject because it is controversial.
Dusan, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah,
Too hot to handle.
Actually, the EU was the first one to put it on the table officially, as a proposal of the institution. So, in the past, there are studies, but it was not done by the international organization or by the country. So, we started it really with this intention to have coordinated international efforts to assess it and also to build governments, legal framework, how to manage it. But in general, I'm not so worried that oil companies would push it for it and try to present it that this is a solution and not to reduce fossil fuels. I think that they are not so interested really to invest huge money with something that is completely uncertain. So I see more role for governments in this area. And the US, they are already also thinking about it, and actually they are planning support research in this area. And I think this is also a way how to cooperate also with the US, but really to involve international society in general. And there are some initiatives already to involve scientists from Global South in research on solar radiation modification. And that I think that it's also in a research program of the EU that there is always intention to involve scientists from Global South. I don't know, in Co-Create project, if you are also thinking about it, but in general, there is support because this is inclusive. And but definitely, I think that governments should play a leading role, but not in everything. On the main stratospheric aerosol injections, there is something that you need technology, so huge airplanes. It's more for countries. Of course, it would be possible also for big companies to publish it, but it's mostly for governments. But there are other technologies, solar radiation modification. That one is also ground-based albedo modification. So actually, locally, it could be like adaptation method. And
so
it's
albedo
used
is where you're doing
whitening
of
roofs,
the
for
roofs,
example,
yes, yeah.
or superficial areas in some abandoned places, or even oceans, in mountains. So it's possible to do it on local level. So it's different. No, it's not like global, large-scale intervention, but could be locally. Also, marine cloud brightening. It could be done locally in some areas that they are the best for that. So they are, and actually they are close to Africa or to Chile.
So just tell me, marine cloud brightening, just quickly.
Yes.
What?
Yeah. So this is sorry. So this is like intervening in the composition of clouds over the ocean, and if you do it in enough places, you increase the reflectivity, so you block some
and
incoming
decrease temperature.
Yep.
Okay.
And
So
actually, it's
like
enough.
what it says on the tin.
It's,
Yes, marine cloud brightening.
it's
Okay.
salty water, so it's
Right.
not so
Yeah.
dangerous.
Yeah.
And actually, in Australia, it's tested. So for protection of coral reefs, there is one project.
And is it working?
They say that yes, but some scientists, they say they have only one problem: they don't have clouds. So actually, they are creating clouds, and so it's not the best place to use marine cloud brightening.
Right.
But it's helping. They are creating some clouds. So, but still, we don't have scientific results. So there is no scientific study presenting results.
Okay, so there's a real leadership role in terms of policy making in this area for the EU in the same way that there was for AI, where you've been a real trailblazer in the EU in terms of getting stuff out there. Let's take some questions from the audience. We've got a question over there. And Alina, let's after.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for the discussion again, Vincent Maynard, AIT, and also part of TechEthos. I think from my experience working on this project and also learning more about climate engineering technologies, I find it's a very interesting technology for many reasons. For one, because it's so unsecure, unclear if it's actually efficient, if it will actually work. We are more or less always living with the hype and with the vision and the hope. As you wonderfully said, we are all so desperate and we hope it will work in one day. And there was one question that was always puzzling my mind. It's touched a little bit similar to the business model question. This is the question of deployment. I mean, because it is such a global problem that we're all facing, are there any strategies, any ideas, or already starting to think about what if we have this technology, how can we deploy it on a global scale, and who would be such a leader of organizing such a deployment process?
That's an easy question. I'm going to Benham.
Oh, I get the easy ones.
Yes.
I can't actually take first step of it, but I think Matthias might be better equipped to answer the question. Yes, there is actually some thinking. People who call for the governance, for the better governance of different, both the CDR and SRM, pointing to this specific issue that you're mentioning, because also the international deployment, also there is a lot of politics and power dynamics that could play a role, even in the nature-based approaches, because that is also very much determining what kind of, for instance, agricultural choices you make. That could be determining for the position of your country, etc., etc.
I mean, imagine if you found that the China Seas were the only place that you could launch your deployment from.
That would be a very interesting observation and sort of conclusion to deal with internationally or geopolitically. So I do think there is some thinking going on into that, but I'm not sure if there is any definitive answer. I'm just looking at Matthias to see if he can add that.
Well, my first reaction would be to ask you, do you have more carbon dioxide removal in mind or solar radiation modification?
Sorry, I was actually thinking about
CDR, okay, gotcha. Well, interestingly, carbon dioxide removal really fits in the governance landscape of climate change mitigation. Even legally speaking, it is a form of climate mitigation. If you look at the language of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement both, they talk about enhancing sinks, which is what essentially happens there. And so it fits within that governance landscape. It also fits in the broader sense of the economics of cutting emissions. Removing CO2 from the atmosphere and durably storing it is basically a continuum of reducing emissions in many ways. Even physically, if you talk about the industrial approach of doing it, which is capturing CO2 at a either point source with biomass as an input or directly from ambient air through direct air capture, that is essentially an industrial installation that then is connected to through a pipeline or otherwise to a storage site. And that's even like by the sheer installations that you need is a continuum from cutting emissions from industrial sources. And so it very much fits into that, and therefore also into the context of nationally determined contributions where parties to the Paris Agreement are pledging and hopefully improving those pledges over time. So you have that mechanism there. Of course, it's flawed and it's widely insufficient so far, but it's a mechanism that we have in place essentially.
If I can,
Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to add on carbon dioxide removal. This is more in like national framework. Many times, like that. This is it has to respect environmental legislation rules in countries. So it's more nationally, except ocean fertilization. This is there is some kind of moratorium stemming from a decision of conference on biological diversity. I think it is from 2010. That is giving restriction on deployment and large-scale tests. And the same is for solar radiation modification. Also, this decision of CBD applies. So actually, it's de facto moratorium on deployment and large-scale tests on SRM.
Benham.
I also thought that you were talking about SRM mostly. When it comes to CDR, one of the important governance issues is also how to count. Because that's going to be a very determining factor for the future of these technologies, also in the ETS, for instance, the European trade system. Because if you are going to count, if you are going to enable a negative emission, you need to be able to count. And the method of counting is going to be very, very crucial too. And that is something that you cannot agree with within a country. There needs to be some kind of agreement between the countries, definitely within the EU, but also between EU and other countries importing to or exporting to the EU. So I think that is also going to be a very important factor.
Alina.
Question is, I understand that probably our panel was more or less from an entertainment point of view. Nevertheless, due to not leaving anybody behind, is there maybe also an opportunity to include emerging technologies such as XR with, for instance, story living aspects of including these technologies to actually put society and individuals in the scenarios? I mean, a great example was flooding Times Square, where community people were actually put in the scenario, if we don't do something, 2040, this will be the outcome. So how could we maybe use XR to sort of simulate and also have a more story living, engaging rather than facts, where, to be honest, society, they couldn't care less currently. I mean, they are bombarded with numbers.
Yes.
And
so
they can't relate.
So everything we know in science engagement, more facts just make no difference. So how about, Dominic, extended reality? Yeah. Where does extended reality, how can it fit in?
So a couple of my students actually were working on something in this space at the moment, and it's interesting, the idea. I must say that I'm a bit skeptical that it does have a role. So I would need to be persuaded that it does the convincing job that we want in this space. So facts don't work. There's various other ways to communicate. It remains to be seen. I'm open to be convinced about it, but I wouldn't assume that building virtual environments where people experience extreme heat or something is going to be motivating. There could be other psychological mechanisms that actually disable action if you expose them to. Yeah, so that's an empirical question, and I'm curious about it.
But it's always going to be...
View.
Yeah.
I share more
Yes.
your view that it would be useful. It would be useful, and actually I think that already some companies, they are doing that. They are developing extended reality or metaverse really to see effects of climate change, or like to see what's going on small islands. And I think this is useful. Definitely it could help.
Although, so I suspect that the people who would take it up might be people who were already persuaded. Yeah. In other words, and it goes back to something you were saying, Benham, about people. If you have some type of, accelerate SRM, then it'll stop people doing other mitigation stuff. But I suspect actually that there are an awful lot of people in the world who are waiting for Bruce Willis. In other words, they are not doing as much as they could do because they're thinking that something will turn up. We're technologically very advanced. Someone is bound to come up with something soon. In other words, Bruce Willis will come riding over the hill.
That's one scenario, and I'm also worried that some politicians will also be believing in that. Well, let's go whatever we are doing. There might be a solution, and a lot of controversy and actually sort of negative image of these kind of technologies go all the way back to the Bush administration, who was also believing in sort of when climate engineering was mentioned, geoengineering back then as a term, that was really almost immediately a call for it's no need for mitigation. Because there is a techno fix. There are bright minds that will come with better solutions. So no worries. So let's go ahead, and that was also a strong push from the fossil industry, of course, in the US and by proxy in the world.
But sometimes it's opposite. People, they are so scared of
they become paralyzed.
So they prefer to do everything possible to
Let's
avoid.
Take a question here.
Agata Górzewska from Trilateral Research and also coordinator of the Verity Project, which focuses on trust in science, research, innovation. And I find your discussion really, really interesting. From the perspective that a couple of you mentioned participation in deliberation, but Dusan also mentioned that, it's actually very difficult to explain this technology. So if people hear about this technology, probably immediately will say, this is evil. So but you all kind of plan to have this participation and deliberation. Of course, we have the European Green Deal, but there, of course, still the engagement is kind of limited. So I'm just really curious, how do you see the deliberation and participation from civil society and empowerment, so to bring back the balance of powers, not only the corporate and the economic actors, in the conversation and really in co-developing the solutions, ultimately also trust science, or maybe there are arguments to not trust science as well.
Okay, Dominic,
Thanks.
let's come to you on that one.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's extremely important actually that we think more about participation and deliberation in this space and in general in relation to climate policy. So there's been a few deliberation platforms across Europe in the last few years, some very big success stories, some kind of with mixed results, but it remains to be seen what the uptake will be in policy. So there's always a thing in political science between the deliberation as an intervention and the wider political implications of this thing, because you cannot do a deliberation with the whole of society ever. So how to get wider implications going from your deliberation is a key challenge.
And there's a difficulty, isn't there? Because governments think, I know I've been in this situation myself, that when you've done a big deliberation, and in science engagement terms, a comprehensive deliberation might involve 100, 300 people, then what you get is government coming back and saying, well, 100's not very many. Can't, and completely dismissing the outcomes of that research. Let's take your question. And would you introduce yourself?
Yes, Michel Bourbon, University of Twente again. Yes, so I have the impression that a lot of the discussion that we can see in the background is about how we frame what we say. And Dominic, you started with this when you reminded the key messages from TechEthos here and elsewhere is about finding good definitions. I think some frames going around are the following. So should we frame geoengineering as a lesser evil? If we compare it with catastrophic climate change, should we frame CDR and SRM as geoengineering or climate engineering? Is SRM solar geoengineering? Is CDR mitigation? And when we go within one category like CDR, should we make the distinction between natural and non-natural CDR? And I was wondering, when we come up with more positive findings and when we try to put forward new ethical frameworks like the risk analysis you proposed, Benham, should we frame this as a precautionary approach or not? Because surprisingly, you did not mention this notion, but Dominic did. So is it useful to think about risk analysis as a precautionary approach? Or would you prefer something that goes closer to what Matthias Honegger was saying in terms of a call for balance. So is it about balancing some kinds of risks against other kinds of risks?
There's a ton of questions in there, but I'm going to throw it all at Benham.
Okay. Let me go with the precautionary principle. That's a very fair question. I think why I didn't even mention the term. I was not trying to avoid the notion altogether. One reason was interest of time. Actually, I didn't put the precautionary principle, how that relates actually to the argumentation that I'm presenting. And the other one is that the precautionary principle very often gets misinterpreted. The precautionary principle does not necessarily mean that you need to refrain from any kind of action. That is sometimes how, in the outside community, sort of the term has been, so the notion has been understood. What I think is that thinking in terms of risks, in terms of actually comparisons of risk within the realms that Dominic was actually presenting, it doesn't say that any kind of risk on the climate change and should be compared to any kind of risk. There needs to be confinement actually. Within certain confinements you need to, because certain risks we could say that they are just completely unacceptable, we should just leave them out altogether. So then in that framework, the precautionary principle could be to an extent, and I mean specific meanings of precautionary principle that help to set the setting for which type of risk we are going to compare with each other. That could be definitely helpful. So I wasn't trying to dodge the term or say that it doesn't matter to the discussion. It was just sort of a time-related issue that I did not mention the term.
Matthias.
Yeah, if I could just actually make a jump and come back somewhat to the point about deliberation, which connects to your presentation as well. I think the point of deliberation is often manifold. One is to have a broad populace being involved in the decision-making process early on, but another is also just to improve our thinking and do that not only in terms of identifying potential factual blind spots in the research landscape. We all come with our disciplines, we have certain tools to analyze the world as it is, and those have their blind spots, but also to identify the normative landscape. And this connects to your presentation. I think right now what we have is a bunch of scientists from various sort of backgrounds, various communities, and logically, and in particular with an emphasis on global north, a handful of countries really only looking into this so far. And naturally, we have a very particular set of values and norms that we bring to this consideration. And so one of the important aspects of deliberation at this point, I think, is to open up that normative landscape and avoid normative blind spots as well. And to do that as a basis, then also to build improved research that acknowledges there are concerns that are very valid, and we need to know more about the degree to which evidence supports or actually reassures those concerns. And I think this is currently a bit underestimated in terms of the debate that we have had so far. It's not necessarily about involving everyone everywhere on the planet, which is absolutely impossible, but to just strengthen the foundation that we have also as a plural.
So there's no danger of groupthink,
yeah.
of kind of in which you convince yourself that this is a particular avenue that needs following, and actually because you haven't heard those public voices, you haven't opened yourself up to what your mum thinks. Or, I mean, I mean that quite seriously, that, you know, we should all be talking about the research that we do to our families to find out what they think about it. I mean, I know your mum always says, I don't know what he does, but he's ever so clever. But actually having those conversations in families sometimes opens your eyes to thinking not that your mum is mad, but, you know, she's got a completely different view which you hadn't thought about before because they are seeing it through different eyes. And that's actually a very important part of scientific thinking, I think.
Can I just add directly on this? So there's a link between deliberation and participation processes and combating misinformation as well. So it's very important to get people out of a passive mode where you can scroll and you share and you have your communities and your bubbles to being confronted with people that have really different values and experiences and having to discuss something in common, make recommendations and so on. So there is some scientific literature on behavior and belief change in response to deliberation processes, and this is quite encouraging. On the other side, we have a growth in misinformation across the board in politics, so that's not encouraging, and these are the real challenges. So how do we, if we come to a point of discussing whether to eventually implement any of the technologies under the SRM category, for example, or even just talking about research governance now, how do we do this with meaningful public knowledge rather than caricatures? So that requires some capacity building here and inclusion.
Now, I was actually looking at Birgit with her knitting here. And I was thinking that actually when you have very polarized opinions and you have tribes who are apart, this is something I was talking about at Falling Walls in Berlin last week, is that you need to find something where the Venn diagrams overlap. So you might hold very strong views in one area and not want to talk to somebody who has very strong views in the opposite area. However, if they did knitting like you, you would be talking to them. So it's actually a question of how do you bring people together enough in an area that's of common interest to them both to start that conversation going in a way that doesn't immediately fracture into disputation.
Switch on the mic, thank you. Actually, I would like I'm a little irritated by the discussion at the moment because it feels like, okay, we have to involve the citizens to hear their opinion. And the one beautiful thing about TechEthos is we actually did that.
Yes, sure.
So we engaged with 300 participants all over Europe, and we're asking them, not all 300, only 100 of them, what they think about climate engineering technologies. And their response was something in the direction of, well, the technology is great if it works. So what they all, to my surprise, we were talking about techno-pessimism before. To my surprise, the participants were open to the technology under certain circumstances. They said, I like the technology, I would support it, I would go for it if it holds what it promises. So talking about reliability, if it works the way it works and not creating more CO2, then I'm up for it. The second one was equity. If the technology is able, or maybe if the way it's deployed in society is able to mitigate the pros and the risks and the benefits globally on an equal scale, then it's good. So those questions are not questions that can be answered by participants or by citizens, but these are A, technological question, and B, political questions. So it's not about putting the question somewhere else to some citizen group, whatever that means. It's about finding solutions in the political realm and in the scientific realm.
Very important point. Dominic.
Can I just respond directly? So on CDR, equity is going to be a key issue. So if we want to do climate policies justly, generally, carbon pricing already raises many equity issues where you can make it regressive. You can put costs predominantly on those at the bottom of the social ladder. Or you can try to equalize it in various ways, or you can distribute carbon revenues back to the most vulnerable. There's many ways of doing this. The same exact issues come up with carbon removal, right? It's very expensive, and who's going to pay for it? So there's a question about efficiency and equity there that we have to think about already now. At the moment, what I'm observing is the lining up of fossil fuel interests to make money by doing this in future, in the interests of their own kind of shareholders, but also efficiency. So efficiency is winning at the moment in this discussion. If we do not want that, we have to reapportion the economic burdens elsewhere. Maybe making those companies pay for their historical contributions, not requiring taxpayers to give money now to fossil fuel companies to do CDR. But that's what is probably likely right now. So these are discussions we need to have as societies to make this fair if we want to do a just transition instead of just a transition.
And there are always, you can do a lot of public engagement work and you think that you know the answers and there are, what the public's red lines are, all of those things. And then when it comes down to how much it might cost them, then people change. I mean, we've seen the situation change on electric vehicles, for instance, because they're suddenly much more expensive. There's a cost of living crisis, and we've seen the number of electric vehicles sold, drop quite considerably. So, there are some pretty base economics
But it's quite complex. So now prices are going down.
Yes.
So it's on some,
yes.
in some aspects it's positive, but definitely like the whole approach, not leaving anybody behind. So no, that it's important at the European level. So there are several funds for that. Just Transformation Fund, Future Social Climate Fund, but also we need to help internationally. So the fund that is going to be created, Loss and Damage Fund, is also contributing to these efforts. Maybe only also to mention that
Briefly,
for new technologies, we need to make people feel safe. So that's the problem with solar radiation modification. If it's in form only like about catastrophic results, possible results, people will be against.
Okay.
So
there's just to kind of sum up, there's a clear and important role for the EU here in policy making. I won't call it an opportunity because that's I don't want to frame this as an opportunity, something that may be a necessity. The clear involvement both in determining public opinion at the start of projects and determining what will be politically acceptable, and also bringing in the equity. And it's a hugely difficult area. But what I take also from you, Benham, is that we need to be thinking about it now. We can't just say, no, we're not even going to think about this. This is all too dangerous, because we may be forced into that situation and we better have thought about it first. So a very good conversation, slightly depressing conversation. But thank you to all our panel, and they were splendid. Thank you very much. So let's go, if I could ask you to take your seats again. So let's go into celebration mode now, and let's look forward. And what better person to have than Maura Heine? Maura, Maura, just tell us your background.
So I'm a microbiologist by trade, but I ended up on the other side, the dark side. So I established and ran a research office. I worked for a long time for a health funding agency, and I'm now an adjunct professor of research integrity in an Irish university, but I'm also the chair of the ALEA working group on science and ethics, permanent working group on science and ethics, and was very involved in the revision of both the 2017 and 2023 European Code of Conduct.
So you can see she's extremely important. She's perfectly placed to just have a look at overview of the role of TechEthos in the ecosystem.
Okay, so good afternoon, and I 5 minutes. I wasn't allowed to use slides, so I'm feeling a little bit
naked.
Naked, yes. I was going to say disabled, but naked, yes. That's the word. Because what Eva and Renate had asked me to look at was where TechEthos sits within that broader research integrity policy context in Europe. Because the European Code of Conduct has become a kind of a major pillar of this policy context, and the European Code of Conduct is on research integrity. It's been just revised in June 2023. The revision was published. It refers to the importance of research environment, which is a key narrative that's starting to develop now, and includes ethics as well as research well-being, research assessment, research integrity, and so on. What it actually offers is a high level, and I stress the word high level, framework for achieving high quality, trustworthy, open and transparent and responsible research. So what it does not do is provide specific details and guidelines. Rather, it signposts that you need robust methodology, that you need honest reporting, that you need to consider societal impacts. So you can see that there's already some crossovers here, that you need to look at the benefits as well as the risks in terms of the research that you're doing, and you need to look at the safeguards in place for research participants and subjects, and those subjects include the environment. So because it's so high level, the Commission identified that actually we needed to have projects that would develop specific guidelines, policy briefs, etc., in their own context. And this is where TechEthos has been a really critical player. So it interfaces, I suppose, with the European Code of Conduct in terms of how the research should be done. So the good practices and the I suppose the doing, the reporting, the dissemination, all of that kind of stuff. But where it sort of goes off on its own is around the whys and the shoulds. So should we be doing this research? And if we should, why should we be doing it? And how, very much in terms of governance and regulation. So I think it's an absolutely fantastic project. Today has been so incredibly interesting to hear about all of the issues that it has flushed out. So it's developed de novo guidelines. It has identified still many gaps, many conversations that need to be had. As you said, it's a little bit depressing. To be honest, we have the same conversations when we talk about research integrity. And you can get a little bit overwhelmed by these things. But I think, how do you eat the elephant? You eat the elephant one bite at a time. So projects like TechEthos are trying to take a few bites out of that very, very complex elephant and reduce the size of the challenge, I guess. They have proposed some fantastic recommendations for the governance and regulation of these technologies and the technology families. And also they have provided some really nice policy briefs, 2 pages, but very important longer policy reports. So, will the policymakers ever read them? Who knows? But, at least they have the policy briefs to keep them warm at night, as it were. And I really like the focus of ethics by design, because again, that interfaces very much with the how. How do you do this research? How do you design it? How do you think about your methodologies, etc.? And if you're thinking always with your ethics by design hat on, that will make an absolutely huge difference. So I suppose I don't want to take up much time because the 2 ladies are at the back here. I think that for me, the message is really that ultimately research integrity and research ethics are both critical components of trust, of quality when it comes to research, and of positive impact. And I really congratulate this project for such amazing work and such fantastic outputs. So thanks.
So thank you, Mara, for that. That was very helpful because it actually shows you exactly how TechEthos is regarded more broadly. It's difficult when you're in it to know how everyone else is seeing your work. Well, there you have it. And she came and did it willingly. Yeah.
No pressure.
No pressure. So let me... So to tell us a bit more about the legacies, well, you've already seen some of the legacies that will come from TechEthos's work, and to know what comes next, let me reintroduce Eva Buchinger, who is the TechEthos coordinator. Then we have Professor Lawrence Brooks, who's Professor of Information Systems at the University of Sheffield. And finally, last but absolutely not least, Renata Klar from the European Network for Research Ethics.
Thank you, Vivian. So what can we say after that, Mara? Thank you so much. I think this was the closing word. So we will be absolutely brief. The highlights we have seen over the day, the embedding we have seen, of course it's clear, TechEthos is not an island, we are linked to other projects. We learned so much from projects like Sienna, Sherpa, Benefit, and many, many others, and we are happy to have something giving away which can be built on. You have already mentioned, thank you so much, Mara. Done all the work more or less what TechEthos has produced, and if someone like you sees it as useful, as meaningful, as something which can be built upon, and this makes us more than happy. Just very brief, Lauren says something because we have mentioned the policy briefs. We had the honor to contribute to a LEA code of conduct. We have done something more with guidelines, and Lawrence will tell this in a few sentences. Another highlight.
Thank you, Eva. So as Eva said, and as has been mentioned already a few times, what we were doing is we were looking at these three very diverse technology families, from the very big global issues around climate engineering that we've just been talking about, from the digital extended reality that we were talking about this morning, and the third family that isn't so much part of today's events, but is also very important, this idea of neurotechnology, which can be kind of in terms of health, but also extension to humans. And what we tried to do was we tried to look at how can we make a real contribution to practical kind of guidelines that might help people thinking about the ethics of these emerging technologies. And one thing I must emphasize is that, the challenge here is that these technologies are emerging. So we don't really know exactly where they're going to go, but we have some ideas that we can think about. So what we did was, rather than try and reinvent the wheel, we talked to our experts who were great at engaging with us, and we got them to suggest a set of 2 existing guidelines in each of these technology families. And then we used the ethical issues and principles, the sorts of thing that Alexei was talking about this morning and Dominic this afternoon. And we looked to say, what can we add to these existing guidelines that will kind of give that kind of added value and extend this concept of what are the ethical concepts that can be brought out to kind of add to these existing guidelines. So build, standing on the shoulders of giants, building on existing work, but kind of adding to it. Just very briefly, as you can see, it's incredibly diverse areas. We did, at the end of that, try and say, okay, if we look across all of those, what are the sorts of key recommendations? And unsurprisingly, they're the sorts of things that you've heard already. But just to kind of summarize, is to think about the kind of training and support for people with these guidelines so that they know how to kind of use them and apply them in a good way, in a responsible way. To think about the diversity of the stakeholder populations and participation. And it was, as it was just mentioned, as part of the project, we reached out to some of these usually kind of unrepresentative populations and tried to kind of draw them in. To think about this kind of ongoing idea of evaluation, Laura from DeepMind talked about this, the idea that you don't evaluate at the end, but you're evaluating as you go along to make sure that these are actually kind of making a contribution and having an impact. To think about the kind of the technology providers and also the policymakers and actually look at the kind of the integration between those. And again, we know that these are big challenges. We're not saying we've solved them, but kind of to highlight them. And then finally, to think about the future. And one of the things we really wanted to draw out was this kind of future orientation and thinking about things like the responsibility to the future. It's very clear in climate engineering that this is a key element, but also in things like the digital extended reality field. Thinking about I have teenagers. I'm sure some of you have kids. The world that they're going to grow up in, the way that they use technology. We have a responsibility to try and create that kind of better future for them, and for future generations as well. And then finally, we also were thinking about how people communicate these ideas and ensuring that the people that are responsible for these are thinking not just about using kind of overly technical terms, but actually making sure that everyone can access this information. So communicating in a kind of an effective way, a good way.
So if you want to look at our deliverables, which I would encourage you to do, but I admit that they're big, you will see that these are the kind of the key highlights that we were trying to draw out, and then hopefully we can take forward.
Thank you. Well, I have the honor to conclude this session, and it's not only the foundation, but it's the continuation of the TechEthos work also, and I have the honor to say just a few words about how some part of this work is to be continued in the future, and I want to link it to another project. So we had a small section on ethics review, and as I'm from the European Network of Research Ethics Committees, EUREC, you know, it's not too surprising that I will say about the work on the ethics review. So we did a bit on how to improve the process within the TechEthos project also. We first identified, or no, we did not identify them, we sharpened the differences from the traditional ethics review in the biomedical field to the very, very different ethics review in the field of emerging technologies, and we identified the challenges that go with it, and we heard a lot about these challenges already here today, particularly that the focus is not on the protection of research participants, but of course on the impact of the technologies on the society and the environment. Yeah, so this is the challenge, of course, for ethics review and Rex. Yeah, how to deal with that. And we heard so much today that it's not easy to do. So we tried to do a little bit within TechEthos. We developed some recommendations on how to improve the ethics review process, and one is we might need multiple stage reviews, and the other is we might need more expertise within the regs. Yeah. So we had only a small part on that within TechEthos, but there are other projects to come, and one is IREX, which is another Horizon Europe project. And this project focuses entirely on ethics review, and I'd say is going to continue the work of TechEthos in a very good way, because they will continue the analysis of the challenges and the adaptation of the ethics review process. And one of the challenges, as said, is the lack of expertise. So in this project, trainings will be developed both for ethicists and for researchers, with the aim of getting a mutual understanding, of getting an exchange. Yeah? And also we are going to suggest adaptations for the ethics review process. So far, maybe this may not sound too thrilling, but IREX is going one step further and trying to get really practical. Yeah? So we are not only developing the trainings and making the proposals, but we are actually trying to implement them. So we are going to have 3 pilots at 3 universities, and in these pilots we will not only test the trainings, but will implement the proposed adaptations for the review process, so that we will get a role model for ethics governance. So I'm really looking forward to that work, which is going to happen within the next 2 years, and say thank you for your attention. And I'd like to say maybe one more word, because we heard so much today, yeah, about regulation and ethics governance, and in the end, what makes this world ethical is an ethical individual. Yeah. So this we cannot make, yeah. But I think there's an interplay between ethical regulation and ethical institutions. We all know it's close to impossible or very challenging to act ethically in an unethical environment. But the opposite is true also. When we have an ethical environment, it gets very hard to act in an unethical way. So I think we all work here together to try to make ethical environments in which ethical acts of individual can flourish. So thank you.
So Renata, that was absolutely terrific and a really fitting end to this event. And I'd also say that actually I think TechEthos has done something else, which is very often if you talk to scientists and you talk to them about ethics and ethics committees, they kind of groan and they see it as a hurdle. And I think what you've done with this is you've shown that ethics is an enabler. It's a support. It's something that is really vital, not because you have to do it, because you have to tick the boxes, but because it is actually a way of doing research which will lead to better research outcomes in the future. And I think that also you've made a great impression on the policy folk. Have they made a great impression? Michaelis, I don't think he's allowed to say no. But I think actually they have made a great impression. And the fact that you've got those honed down 2 pages, I think is just such an achievement, real achievement. And call me old-fashioned, but I don't think that those are going to just sit in the EU library on a dusty shelf. I think that they're going to be used, and actually people are going to be extremely grateful and appreciative that they're there, because this is difficult, hard work, and you've done a lot of thinking for people. So, and Mara absolutely agrees with you, you've done the thinking to make it easier for people, as you said, Renata, to do the right thing. So thank you to everyone at TechEthos. Stand up, everyone at TechEthos. Stand up. Congratulations. Hooray.